For some reason, the division of Mortal Kombat's eras is a major point of contention in the fandom. What is agreed upon is that there are three primary eras consisting of the Classic era, the 3D era, and the Netherrealm era. We're arguably entering a new era with M1K, so that last one might need a new name soon, but we can worry about that another time. The line between 3D and Netherrealm is very clearly defined. The Netherrealm era begins with the first game by Netherrealm Studios, Mortal Kombat 2011. But the divide between the first two eras is much more contentious. For some, it's the 2D era of MK1 to 3, then the 3D era of MK4 to DC Universe. For others, it's the arcade era of MK1 to 4 and the 3D era of Deadly Alliance to DC Universe. No one really cares where Special Forces fits in. Some people argue MK4 is a transitionary period between eras and will occasionally say the same of DCU, but it's far more common with MK4. To me, this is just an excuse to not engage with the debate. Bloody cowards. So let's discuss the hard lines that distinguish the eras to help us place MK4. A common view is that MK4 is part of the 3D era because it has 3D graphics. And that's the entire extent of the argument for most people. I'll debunk this one later. I had one person say that the shift to a new threat from Shao Kahn makes MK4 part of the next era, where each game had a new antagonist, and that argument certainly got more depth to it, but given that Outworld wasn't even relevant to MK1, the series already changed antagonistic focus in the arcade era. Plus, the death of Shao in the next game seems more of a firm disconnection from the Shao era than him sitting a game out or potentially being Reiko. And Shinnok and Quan Chi debuted in an inarguably 2D era game, MK Mythologies, which MK4 is a direct sequel to, and which ties itself to MK3 via its backstory. Deadly Alliance is the clear break here, no pun intended. Still, the argument is valid. I've never seen anyone make this argument, but I'll be generous and say Netherrealm seemed to view it this way, with the retro costumes snubbing MK4 the way it did with the 3D era, while constantly bringing back MK1 to 3 costumes. There was MK4 Quan Chi and MKX, and that's it. But this is mostly a joke. And that's all the arguments I can see for it. MK4 is basically just MK3 again, but with 3D graphics, sidestepping and side knockback as a small part of the gameplay, weapons, and stage interaction. While these things were all expanded upon in the 3D era and did not exist in the 2D games, MK4 to Deadly Alliance was a much larger shift than this. With multiple fighting styles and sidestepping as a core part of the experience, and brand new musical and aesthetic sensibilities compared to MK4's MK3 but in 3D style, make those games feel far more different from MK4 than MK4 does from older entries. You can't define MK4 as 3D just because it has a barely functional sidestep you have to double tap the trigger-based run button to use. It's disingenuous to do so. So then, it must be considered 3D because of the graphics, right? If the 3D era is defined solely by the use of 3D graphics, then what's the distinction between that era and the Netherrealm one? Those games have 3D graphics too. Why aren't they part of the era with which they share what is supposedly the most essential component? Why would the final game released in arcades not be defined more by that than the aspect that every subsequent era would make use of but still be divided down different lines? The 3D era is the 3D era because of its 3D gameplay. Its unique signature compared to what came before and after is the focus on 3D movement as a core feature. MK4 has 3D movement, but it's not as integral to the experience as it is from Deadly Alliance to DCU. And when the series decided to harken back to its roots with MK9, the game played a lot more like MK1 to 4 than MK4 did to the 3D games. In addition to that, the way the games were made and the people behind them were fundamentally different from MK4 to Deadly Alliance. John Tobias was the lead storyteller for MK1 to 4. He left midway between MK4 and Deadly Alliance, leading to John Vogel taking over as lead writer, and the style and focus of the storytelling changed with that. And the status quo shift of the hero and main villain both being killed by the new threat is a far more impactful start to a new era, akin to the timeline resets of later eras, than, oh, here's a new bad guy who's doing the same thing as the last one, and he goes down to the same guy who always wins. The series stopped being released in arcades after MK4, instead going straight to consoles. This facilitated the larger mode selections in the Crypt, Conquest, and numerous minigames, none of which are in MK4, which is basically a simple arcade port like prior games. And again, there's a huge shift in gameplay style that is distinct from what came before and after. And the character designs changed drastically in this era with a lot more experimentation compared to MK4 largely just doing what prior games did, but with a few tweaks. It's also a lot cleaner when viewing the release timings. Arcade releases were never more than 2 years apart, but there was a half-decade gap between MK4 and 5, and then no more than 2 between 3D era releases. You can also split each era by decade, with the arcade era spanning the 90s, the 3D era the noughties, the NetherRealm era the 10s, and the new era the 20s. Comparing the logic behind the names for the eras, it's clear which era MK4 should slot into, the arcade era. Even if you call it the 2D era, it still fits in there. The game is just UMK3 with 3D graphics with a few new mechanics one would expect to see in a sequel, while Deadly Alliance was fundamentally different from everything that came before, feeling like a completely different franchise at times, with a drastic overhaul in gameplay, production, writing, aesthetic, pretty much everything. So yeah, I don't think there's all that much room to dispute the assertion that Mortal Kombat 4 is part of the arcade era and Deadly Alliance started the 3D era. And if you disagree, that's fine, but Ed Boon himself divides the series up this way. According to the man himself, MK4 is officially part of the arcade era. If you don't like it, then you're mad! And you can bloody well stay mad. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then you must be one of those MK4 is 3D era truthers, which is not a good look, I must say. Today's recommended video is Mortal Kombat 4 isn't a 3D era game by HarperLarp, because he's also correct. Objectively, stay mad.